In the quiet stretches of the Hamptons, where old money tends to speak through land rather than words, the story of Robert Mercer begins not with construction, but with absence. The house in question had stood since the 1920s, built at a time when coastal estates were statements of permanence rather than speculation. Its walls had absorbed decades of seasonal life, summer gatherings, long winters of vacancy, caretakers moving through rooms designed for families who only briefly returned. By the early 21st century, it was no longer remarkable in the way it once had been, but it still held the quiet authority of age, a structure that had simply endured longer than most things around it. The property sat within the broader geography of the Hamptons, a region that had transformed repeatedly over the last century, shifting from rural retreat to one of the most expensive residential zones in the United States. Land values there no longer reflected buildings as much as they reflected potential. Houses could be erased without sentiment if the land beneath them justified it. This reality shaped the transaction that followed. Mercer's purchase did not arrive with spectacle. There were no public declarations, no architectural previews, no announcements of restoration. The acquisition moved through standard channels, appearing at first as another high-value real estate transfer in a region accustomed to them. The price reflected the acreage, the proximity to the ocean, and the scarcity of comparable parcels. The house itself, though historically rooted, was not the asset being pursued. It was incidental. Those who tracked such transactions would have recognized the pattern. Buyers operating at that financial level often approached property differently than conventional homeowners. They did not necessarily intend to inhabit what they purchased. Instead, ownership became a form of control over land use, privacy, and future development. In this context, the mansion's fate was effectively decided before the sale closed, even if no formal plans had been disclosed. House, built in the 1920s, reflected an architectural vocabulary common to that era: symmetry, large windows designed to capture ocean light, and an internal layout that prioritized formal gathering spaces over modern efficiency. It had likely been renovated in parts over the decades, updated enough to remain functional, but not enough to compete with newly constructed luxury estates nearby. By contemporary standards in the Hamptons, it was outdated, though still structurally sound. After the purchase, the property entered a phase of stillness that to outside observers appeared unremarkable. There were no immediate signs of change, no construction crews arrived, no demolition permits were visibly posted. The house remained standing, its presence unchanged, as if the transaction had altered nothing at all. This period of inactivity was not unusual. Wealthy property owners often held land without immediate action, allowing time for planning, permitting, and strategic decisions that did not require public visibility. What distinguished this case was what followed and how quietly it happened. Demolition, particularly in regulated and high-profile areas like the Hamptons, typically involves layers of documentation and community awareness. Permits must be filed. Environmental considerations must be addressed. Neighboring properties are often notified. Yet in this instance, the removal of the mansion occurred with minimal public attention. By the time most people understood what had happened, the structure was already gone. The process itself was methodical rather than dramatic. There was no singular moment of destruction that marked the house's end. Instead, it was dismantled in stages, consistent with local regulations that often require controlled deconstruction rather than explosive demolition. Materials would have been separated, certain elements possibly salvaged, others discarded. The physical disappearance of the building unfolded over days or weeks, not seconds. From a distance, it might have looked like maintenance work. A truck here, a crew there, incremental changes that did not immediately signal finality. Only over time did the absence become clear. The outline of the house, once a fixed presence, gave way to open space. What had been a structure became a cleared parcel, indistinguishable from land that had never been built upon. Mercer never moved in. There were no records of occupancy, no evidence that the house served even temporarily as a residence. It existed under his ownership only long enough to be removed. This fact became central to the narrative that later formed around the property. The idea that a mansion could be purchased, never used, and then erased introduced a tension between conventional notions of home and the realities of wealth at scale. Locally, reactions were muted but not absent. In regions like the Hamptons, residents are accustomed to change driven by capital. Houses are renovated, expanded, or replaced with frequency. Yet the complete removal of a standing mansion without immediate redevelopment raised questions. Why eliminate a usable structure without replacing it? Why incur the cost of demolition without an apparent plan to build? The answers, while not publicly stated, can be inferred from patterns common among ultra-wealthy property owners. Privacy is often a primary concern. Large estates can serve as buffers, creating physical distance from neighbors and public access points. By clearing the land, an owner gains flexibility, space that can be left untouched, landscaped minimally, or held indefinitely without the constraints imposed by an existing structure. There is also the matter of control over sightlines and surroundings. In coastal areas, views are both valuable and contested. Removing a building can alter how a property interacts with its environment, even if no new construction follows. Open land can function as a form of negative architecture, shaping space through absence rather than presence. As the cleared lot settled into its new state, the story began to circulate more widely. It moved beyond local awareness into broader discussions about wealth, property, and the ways in which resources can be used to reshape physical environments with little resistance. The mansion, once a tangible object, became a reference point, something described rather than seen. In this transformation from structure to story, the details of the house itself began to fade. What remained was the sequence of actions: purchase, silence, demolition. Each step was straightforward on its own. Together, they formed a narrative that felt disproportionate to its components, as if something larger was being illustrated through a relatively simple set of events. The land remained. That, ultimately, was the constant. Long before the mansion was built, it existed as part of the coastal landscape. After the demolition, it returned to that state, though now defined by ownership that carried different implications than it had a century earlier. The absence of the house did not restore the past. It created a new condition shaped by contemporary realities. Understanding this first phase requires setting aside assumptions about intention that are rooted in typical residential behavior. Mercer's actions were consistent with a different framework, one in which property is not primarily about habitation, but about strategic positioning. The mansion's removal was not an anomaly within that framework. It was an expression of it. The story does not end with the disappearance of the building. In many ways, that moment marks the beginning of a more complex set of questions about what it means to own land at this scale, about how visibility and invisibility function in high-value transactions, and about the subtle ways in which landscapes are altered without drawing attention. Those questions unfold in what follows, but they all trace back to this initial sequence, where a house built to last a century was erased in a matter of weeks, not because it failed, but because it no longer served a purpose within the logic of its new owner. After the demolition, the property entered a phase that, to an outside observer, might have appeared uneventful, but in reality represented a deliberate state of control. The cleared land did not immediately transform into a construction site. There were no cranes, no foundation work, no visible indications that a new structure would replace what had been removed. Instead, the parcel remained open, its surface adjusted only enough to stabilize the ground and comply with local environmental requirements. This absence of development was not accidental. In high-value real estate markets like the Hamptons, inaction can be as strategic as construction. Holding land without building on it preserves optionality. It allows the owner to respond to regulatory changes, market conditions, or personal priorities without being constrained by an existing structure. In Mercer's case, the decision not to rebuild immediately reinforced the idea that the mansion had not been purchased as a home, but as an element within a broader, less visible plan. Local zoning regulations play a significant role in shaping what can and cannot be done with a property. These rules govern building size, setbacks, environmental impact, and usage. By clearing the existing structure, Mercer effectively reset the property's status. Any future development would be evaluated as new construction rather than a modification of an existing building. This distinction matters because it can influence what is permissible under current regulations compared to those in place when the original mansion was built. Environmental considerations are particularly relevant in coastal regions. Properties in the Hamptons are often subject to oversight related to wetlands, erosion control, and habitat preservation. Demolition requires adherence to these rules, including proper disposal of materials and mitigation of any ecological disruption. The methodical nature of the mansion's removal suggests compliance with these requirements, even if the process itself remained largely out of public view. What made the situation notable was not that the house was demolished, but that it disappeared without being replaced. In a region where new construction frequently pushes the limits of size and luxury, an empty lot represents a kind of restraint, or at least a deviation from typical patterns. It introduces a gap in a landscape otherwise defined by expansion. Speculation about Mercer's intentions began to circulate, though it remained largely speculative due to the absence of public statements. Some observers suggested that the land might be held as a privacy buffer, ensuring that no neighboring development could encroach too closely. Others considered the possibility that future construction was planned but delayed, perhaps due to design considerations or regulatory timing. There is also a financial dimension to consider. For individuals operating at Mercer's level of wealth, the cost of purchasing and demolishing a mansion, while substantial in absolute terms, may not represent a significant constraint. The decision can therefore be evaluated less in terms of expense and more in terms of outcome. If the result, greater control over land, enhanced privacy, or strategic positioning, aligns with broader objectives, the cost becomes secondary. The absence of the house also alters how the property is perceived from surrounding areas. Where there was once a defined structure, there is now openness. This can change sightlines, reduce visual density, and create a sense of space that extends beyond the property's boundaries. In a place where views are closely guarded and often monetized, such changes can have subtle but meaningful effects. It is important to note that Mercer's approach is not entirely unique among ultra-wealthy property owners, though it is relatively rare in its execution. There have been instances where buyers acquire properties primarily to control their use or to prevent certain types of development. What distinguishes this case is the combination of complete demolition and prolonged inactivity, which together create a narrative that is both simple and difficult to interpret. From a historical perspective, the removal of the mansion represents the end of a particular architectural lineage. Houses built in the 1920s in the Hamptons were part of a broader pattern of development tied to a specific era of wealth and social behavior. Their designs reflected the priorities of that time: formal entertaining, seasonal occupancy, and a certain relationship to landscape that differs from contemporary approaches. By demolishing the structure, Mercer effectively removed one of these historical artifacts, replacing it not with a new interpretation, but with absence. This raises questions about preservation and value. In many contexts, buildings of that age might be considered for historical protection, especially if they possess architectural or cultural significance. However, such designations are not universal, and in areas driven by private ownership and high land values, preservation often competes with redevelopment. The mansion's fate suggests that it did not carry sufficient formal protection to prevent its removal, or that such protections were not pursued. As time passed, the cleared lot became normalized within the landscape. What had initially drawn attention gradually faded into the background, becoming just another property among many. This normalization is an important part of how such actions are absorbed into broader patterns. What seems unusual at first can become unremarkable once it persists. Yet the underlying dynamics remain significant: the ability to acquire, erase, and hold land without immediate use reflects a level of agency that is not widely accessible. It highlights the asymmetry between different types of property ownership, between those who must use land to justify its cost and those who can hold it as an abstract asset. In this context, Mercer's actions can be understood less as a singular event and more as an illustration of systemic possibilities. The mansion was not demolished because it was uninhabitable or structurally compromised. It was removed because it did not align with the owner's objectives, whatever those may have been. The land, by contrast, retained its value precisely because it could be redefined. This distinction between structure and land is central to understanding the broader implications of the story. Buildings are temporary, even when they last a century. Land persists, and its value is shaped by factors that extend beyond any single use. By eliminating the mansion, Mercer effectively stripped the property down to its most fundamental component. The narrative, however, continues to evolve, because the absence of a visible outcome invites ongoing interpretation. Without a new structure to anchor the story, attention remains focused on the decision itself rather than its consequences. This creates a kind of suspended meaning, where the significance of the action is not fully resolved. In examining this phase, it becomes clear that the demolition was not an endpoint, but a transition. It marked the shift from a property defined by its past to one defined by its potential. What that potential ultimately becomes is less important than the fact that it exists as a form of controlled uncertainty, an asset shaped as much by what is not there as by what might be. As the property settled into its new condition, the broader context surrounding Robert Mercer began to influence how the story was interpreted. Mercer's background in finance, particularly his association with quantitative investment strategies, positioned him within a framework where decisions are often guided by data, probability, and long-term optimization rather than conventional sentiment. While there is no direct evidence linking those methodologies to this specific real estate action, the alignment in mindset is difficult to ignore. In quantitative finance, assets are evaluated not for what they are, but for what they can become under different conditions. Variables are isolated, scenarios are modeled, and outcomes are assessed in terms of expected value. Translating that logic to real estate suggests an approach where a property is not viewed as a home, but as a set of attributes: location, size, regulatory status, and potential configurations. Within that framework, the existing mansion could be seen as a constraint rather than an asset. Removing the structure simplifies the equation. It eliminates variables related to renovation, maintenance, and historical preservation. What remains is a cleaner dataset, so to speak, land that can be evaluated and utilized without the complications introduced by an inherited building. This does not necessarily mean that Mercer approached the decision explicitly in these terms, but the parallel provides a useful lens through which to understand the outcome. The secrecy surrounding the demolition further reinforces this interpretation. In many high-profile real estate transactions, visibility is part of the process. Developers showcase plans, architects present designs, and owners signal their intentions through public filings and announcements. In this case, the lack of such signaling suggests a preference for minimizing attention. The fewer variables introduced by public scrutiny, the greater the degree of control retained by the owner. This approach aligns with a broader pattern observed among individuals who prioritize privacy as a core asset. In such cases, visibility is not neutral. It is a liability that can attract interest, speculation, and interference. By conducting the demolition with minimal exposure, Mercer effectively reduced the informational footprint of the action. The result is a property that exists physically but remains conceptually opaque. Opacity, in this context, has value. It limits the ability of external observers to predict or influence future actions. It preserves flexibility by avoiding commitments that might arise from public expectations. And it allows decisions to be made within a closed loop, where information is controlled rather than distributed. At the same time, the story's emergence into public awareness illustrates the limits of such control. Even actions taken quietly can become visible after the fact, particularly when they involve tangible changes to physical environments. The disappearance of a mansion is not something that can be entirely concealed, especially in a region where properties are closely observed by neighbors, local authorities, and real estate professionals. Once the story entered public discourse, it began to function as a case study. Commentators used it to explore themes related to wealth inequality, land use, and the evolving nature of property ownership. Some framed it as an example of excess, emphasizing the apparent waste involved in demolishing a usable structure. Others approached it more analytically, focusing on the strategic logic that might underpin such a decision. These interpretations, while varied, share a common limitation. They are based on incomplete information. Without direct insight into Mercer's intentions, any explanation remains speculative. This uncertainty is not a flaw in the narrative. It is a defining characteristic. The absence of explicit reasoning forces observers to rely on inference, which in turn reflects their own assumptions about how wealth is deployed. From a purely structural perspective, the property now exists as a blank state. This condition is rare in developed areas where most land is already assigned a specific use. A blank state is valuable because it is uncommitted. It can be shaped in multiple directions, constrained only by external regulations and the owner's preferences. In this sense, the demolition can be seen as an act of resetting, a way of returning the property to a point where all options are theoretically available. The concept of resetting is particularly relevant in environments characterized by rapid change. The Hamptons, despite its reputation for stability, has undergone significant transformation over the past few decades. Architectural styles have evolved, property sizes have increased, and the expectations associated with luxury living have shifted. In such a context, a building constructed in the 1920s may no longer align with contemporary standards, even if it remains functional. By removing the mansion, Mercer effectively disengaged from that historical trajectory. He chose not to adapt the existing structure to modern expectations, nor to preserve it as a relic of a previous era. Instead, he eliminated it entirely, creating a condition that is neither old nor new, but simply open. This openness carries both advantages and ambiguities. On one hand, it provides maximum flexibility. On the other, it lacks definition. A property without a structure does not communicate a clear purpose. It exists in a kind of conceptual suspension where its value is understood, but its role is not. Over time, such suspension can lead to normalization, as discussed earlier, but it can also sustain interest precisely because it resists resolution. The longer the land remains undeveloped, the more it invites questions about what, if anything, will eventually take its place. Each passing season without visible change reinforces the sense that the original decision was not tied to a conventional timeline. In this way, the story extends beyond the physical boundaries of the property. It becomes part of a larger conversation about how space is used and controlled in high-value reshape, where the motivations of individual owners can shape landscapes in ways that are both subtle and significant. The mansion's absence is not just a local nkotona. It is a reflection of broader dynamics that operate wherever wealth intersects with land. Understanding this phase requires accepting that not all actions are intended to produce immediate or visible outcomes. Some decisions are made precisely to avoid such outcomes, to maintain a state of readiness rather than to achieve a defined end. Mercer's demolition of the mansion fits within this category. It is less about what was done and more about what was enabled by doing it. In the years following the demolition, the property's continued lack of development has become its most defining feature. The land remains under the ownership of Robert Mercer, and the absence of a new structure has shifted the narrative from a single highatna'ain to an ongoing condition. What was once a story about demolition has become a study in sustained inactivity, an outcome that is, in itself, a form of action. To understand the significance of this, it is necessary to consider how value is maintained in real estate without active use. In most cases, property derives its worth from a combination of location, improvements, and income potential. Removing a structure eliminates one of these components, yet in high-demand, like the Hamptons, the underlying land can retain or even increase its value independently. Scarcity plays a central role here. There is a finite amount of coastal land, and demand for it remains consistently high among affluent buyers. This dynamic allows for a form of ownership that is decoupled from traditional utilization. The property does not need to generate income or serve as a residence to justify its existence. Its value is embedded in its potential and its exclusivity. By holding the land in an undeveloped state, Mercer effectively preserves both, while avoiding the complications that come with active use. There is also a temporal dimension to consider. Real estate decisions at this level are often made with extended time horizons. What appears as inactivity over a few years may be part of a longer strategy that spans decades. The absence of immediate development does not imply the absence of intent. It may simply indicate that the intended outcome does not require urgency. At the same time, the property's current state functions as a form of negative presence within the landscape. It is noticeable not because of what it contains, but because of what it lacks. In an environment where most parcels are built upon, an empty lot of significant size stands out, even if subtly. It creates a visual and conceptual gap that distinguishes it from its surroundings. This gap has implications beyond aesthetics. It affects how neighboring properties are experienced, how space is perceived, and how the Arabic alif, Arabic lam, Arabic meme, Arabic noon, Arabic tart, Arabic kaf, Arabic tet mabuta as a whole evolves. In this sense, the decision to demolish without rebuilding contributes to the shaping of the local environment, even in the absence of new construction. It is an example of how Arabic tain, Arabic dal, Arabic meme, Arabic alif, Arabic lam, Arabic fa, Arabic tain, Arabic lam can influence outcomes as effectively as deliberate development. From a regulatory perspective, the property remains subject to the same rules that govern other parcels in the area. Any future development would need to comply with zoning laws, environmental protections, and building codes. The fact that no such development has occurred suggests either that no application has been made or that any plans remain in a preliminary stage. Without public filings, the specifics remain unknown. The story's endurance is tied to this lack of closure. If a new mansion were built, the narrative would shift to focus on its design, scale, and impact. The demolition would become a prelude rather than the central event. By contrast, the continued absence of construction keeps the original action at the forefront, allowing it to be revisited and reinterpreted over time. In broader terms, the Mkhatona illustrates a particular relationship between wealth and space, one in which the ability to choose not to use a resource is as significant as the ability to acquire it. This contrasts with more common scenarios, where ownership is closely tied to utilization. Here, ownership itself is sufficient. The land does not need to perform, it only needs to exist under the control of its owner. This distinction has implications for how we understand property in contexts of extreme wealth. It challenges assumptions about efficiency, productivity, and purpose that are often applied to land use. It suggests that beyond a certain threshold, these concepts become secondary to considerations of autonomy and control. At the same time, it is important to avoid overstating the uniqueness of the Mkhatona. While the specifics are unusual, the underlying mechanisms are not unprecedented. Similar patterns can be observed in other hiksheto, where high-value properties are held without active development. What makes this case notable is the clarity with which those mechanisms are exposed through a single, well-defined sequence of actions. The mansion story, then, is not just about its disappearance, but about what that disappearance reveals. It shows how physical structures can be subordinated to abstract objectives, how visibility can be managed even in the face of tangible change, and how land can function as a strategic asset independent of its immediate use. In the end, the property remains what it has become, a cleared parcel in one of the most expensive regions in the United States, defined less by what stands on it than by the decisions that have shaped it. The house that once occupied the space has receded into memory, its Arabic ta, Arabic fa, Arabic alif, Arabic sada, Arabic yet, Arabic lam, replaced by a narrative that continues to circulate precisely because it lacks a definitive conclusion. There is no final moment that resolves the story. No clear statement of intent that explains the sequence in full. Instead, there is a sustained condition, land held, structure removed, future undefined. For most properties, this would be a transitional phase. Here, it has become the outcome itself. And in that outcome, the logic of the original decision becomes clearer, not through explanation, but through persistence.